And I'm going to talk to you this morning a little bit about rewilding and what it is, maybe what it isn't, how it can apply to us here in Ireland, some of the barriers to rewilding, and why we need rewilding in the first place. So rewilding, I think, at least I think people are quite familiar with the word these days. It has gained quite a lot of popular traction. The history of the word goes back to the 1990s. Its origins are in America. There were biologists there who formulated the idea, and they had three key principles to do with rewilding. It was about having core areas for nature conservation. It was about having corridors that linked up those areas, and it was about carnivores, because carnivores are the keystone species in many of these ecosystems, and of course in the United States they had been largely eradicated. So that became known as the 3 Cs. Now, fast forward to 2013, and George Monbiot, who some of you may know, he's a journalist with the Guardian newspaper, he wrote a book called Feral. And Feral really popularized the word rewilding and the idea of rewilding, and there's a TED talk to go with it. And then also around the same time we had, you know, the story of Yellowstone and how wolves can reshape rivers and all of that. And I think that those two things really captured the public imagination. Now, in recent years, we've had David Attenborough calling to rewild the world. And we saw even yesterday Greta Thunberg on Twitter for World Forest Day talking about rewilding. So rewilding, I think, has gained a certain position in the debate. But I think it's still, maybe there's a lot of misunderstanding about it, or there's a lot of debate about it. So let's see what do we know or what we don't know about it. And I think actually the starting point for rewilding really is recognizing the scale of the climate and the biodiversity emergency that we face today. And I imagine a lot of people who are listening this morning don't need to be convinced about that. That we know that ecosystems in Ireland have effectively collapsed. We know that climate is going through a dramatic breakdown, and we know that now we're looking at, you know, major ecological shifts in global ecosystems that threaten human society. And, you know, let's be honest, it's probably an awful lot worse than a lot of us think. It's a difficult thing to engage with. So maybe if you don't engage with that, well, then rewilding won't make a whole lot of sense to you. But I think if you do recognize the scale of the damage that has been done and the scale of the challenge that we face, well, then all of a sudden rewilding opens up this world of opportunity that we have before us. Now, what is rewilding? I mean, I think possibly what we don't have is a accepted definition of rewilding. So a lot of us will be familiar with nature conservation as it has been applied or not been applied in Ireland over the last decades. A lot of you will be familiar with the idea of nature restoration, which was about trying to undo damage and recreate ecosystem functioning, and those things are quite established, whereas rewilding is not so established, so it doesn't have an accepted definition. Now, there is work underway on that, and I saw yesterday the IUCN published a paper talking about rewilding and talking about principles of rewilding. So I think even though it lacks an accepted definition, there is broad agreement about what it is and what it isn't. So maybe I'll talk first about what it isn't. First of all, it isn't a cure-all. It isn't the be-all and end-all of solutions. It is a solution. It is a solution that can work at scale. It's not about looking backwards. It's not about trying to recreate ecosystems that may or may not have existed at some point in the past. Ecologists will recognize that ecosystems are inherently dynamic, and also, particularly in the Irish context, we don't know an awful lot about the ecosystems that existed 200 years ago, never mind 2,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. It's a very, very dark and foggy kind of a place. So rewilding is not about trying to recreate something that may or may not have existed in the past. It's not anti-human. And I hear that accusation leveled on it quite a lot. And I think that largely goes to the heart of our ethical relationship with nature. If you see yourself as a part of nature, if you see your community as living within an ecosystem, well, then rewilding can't be anti-human. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no conflicts associated with rewilding. There are, and I think there's a responsibility on those of us who promote rewilding to recognize what those conflicts are and to engage with the people who may lose out because of rewilding. It's not anti-farming. We're going to need farming into the future. Hunter-gathering is not an option for 7, soon to be 9 billion people. So farming is essential, but it also recognizes that farming has gone beyond the limits of nature, and an awful lot of our environmental problems have farming at their heart, largely in Ireland, because farming is such a dominant land use. No matter what farming does, whether it's for good or for ill, it's going to have an outsized impact. But at the same time, rewilding is not farming. So you can't farm and rewild at the same time. And really, rewilding is about not having direct commercial exploitation on a particular piece of land. And the last thing that it's not about focusing on a single species. And this is something that a lot of people who have trained as ecologists and trained in traditional nature conservation find it hard to get away from, because the approach that we've taken over the last 30 years is that we've identified the species that need saving, and we have identified areas where those species are located, and we've drawn lines around those, and we've decided, okay, this area is protected for the freshwater pearl mussel, or it's protected for the otter, or it's protected for Atlantic old ancient woodland, or whatever. And we see those protected areas completely in isolation from the surrounding countryside. We ignore the fact that nature is dynamic. Populations naturally go up and down. Habitats move in time and space, whereas our approach to conservation doesn't recognize that. And of course, I don't think I have to overemphasize the fact that our approach to conservation hasn't worked, because we're still losing our biodiversity. So what is rewilding? So to me, rewilding is definitely looking forward. It's about addressing the climate and biodiversity emergency. It's about being adaptive. It recognizes that nature is dynamic, that we don't know an awful lot about it. We don't know an awful lot about ecosystems. And rewilding is relaxed about that. It's okay. You know, we don't know the outcome. We don't have an end point. We don't know what species will benefit or maybe will suffer because of what we're doing, and we're pretty relaxed about that. Rewilding is also multifaceted. It's about a lot more than the technical nuts and bolts of rebuilding an ecosystem. There's an ethical side to it as well. It's also about giving space to nature. Now, that's something that we really struggle with in Ireland, because effectively we have nowhere in Ireland, on land or at sea, except for maybe a few tiny little scraps that are primarily for nature, for the conservation of biodiversity. They simply don't really exist at any meaningful level, and that is a problem for people. And I think that inspires the criticisms that rewilding is anti-nature and anti-people. But I disagree. I think we have taken so much from the natural world that it is time to start giving back, and it is time to start seeing ourselves as part of these systems. And in that regard, I think there's a lot to be gained from rewilding. So rewilding is a lot more about processes about recognizing the fundamental ecological processes that are going on in any given landscape and allowing those processes to occur. So an example of a process would be predation, for instance, or herbivory, or hydrology. And so we see in Ireland that rewilding is happening today in a lot of our boglands. In particular, we have an announcement where we're going to re-wet and restore the hydrology of the 33,000 hectares actually of Midlands bog that has been mined out. And that's about restoring the hydrology. And then we're not really concerned about whether one particular species benefits from it or not. We're going to allow nature take its course. And if there are places where sphagnum moss doesn't grow and we get trees, well then that's fine. We'll get nice little bits of woodland. We'll get lakes, and we'll get wetlands, and we'll get wet grasslands, and we'll get all these different kinds of habitats. And so rewilding, in effect, even though so many people are very reluctant to use the word, is happening in Ireland. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about how rewilding might apply to our rivers. Now, this is the River Shannon, and it's a beautiful stretch of the River Shannon, and you can see it's a broad and it's a slow-flowing river. But we know that an awful lot of our rivers don't look like this. Our rivers are under tremendous pressure from every which way we look. We know they're polluted. About half of our rivers are polluted, and a lot of that pollution is concentrated in the lowlands, which I guess you would expect where to find the pollution, because rivers tend to concentrate everything that's going on in the landscape around them. We know that there's an awful lot of arterial drainage and land drainage going on, and that affects the hydrology of the rivers. So, for instance, a lot of you will be familiar with the freshwater pearl mussel, which is critically endangered. And one of the significant pressures on the pearl mussel is this change in the natural hydrology of river systems. The way the rivers flow has changed. And that is largely due to land drainage, enormous scale land drainage. Now, we also have flooding, which is a particular problem for people living in towns or maybe living alongside close to river systems. We have vegetation removal, and I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about here. This is what I mean about vegetation removal. And we know that riparian vegetation is absolutely essential to the way that rivers function. A lot of the invertebrate life and other life comes from the riparian vegetation, and we've removed it in so many places. Arterial drainage schemes like this also affect the shape of the river, so the river can't flow the way that it would want to flow. Rivers naturally meander, and arterial drainage prevents that from happening. Woody debris. We know that branches and twigs and even whole trees falling into rivers is part of how rivers work. It provides habitats for fish and invertebrates, and it is part of the nutrient recycling in rivers. But we don't allow that to happen. We're terrified of trees falling into rivers in case something floods. So we get what you see in the picture there. That's the lower River Shannon special area of conservation, by the way. That is among our most important areas internationally for nature conservation. And this is what happens in our SACs. And of course, this is our drinking water. I live in Dublin. The November before last, that was 2019, hundreds of thousands of people went without drinking water because the treatment plant at Leixlip wasn't working. And we were told that the problem in Leixlip was to do with UV filters and certain disinfecting agents that were missing or were broken down. But nobody was asking what's happening in the uplands, what's happening in the river going into the plant that allowed it to be contaminated with Cryptosporidium and Giardia, these harmful pathogens that make us sick. And that question simply wasn't asked. So what would rewilding do? So basically, what if we get it right? So rewilding is about allowing rivers, recognizing that rivers are dynamic, recognizing that they play vital roles in recycling nutrients and in regulating the flow of water off our land. And so any kind of rewilding would allow those things to happen. So that would allow us, involve us removing dams on rivers. I know that Ardnacrusha is coming up to 100 years old. Is it time to remove Ardnacrusha and all the other kind of pointless dams that were erected for electricity generation nearly 100 years ago? We need to reform the Arterial Drainage Act. I think that's quite urgent. The Arterial Drainage Act legally requires the OPW to periodically, routinely go into rivers and clear the bankside vegetation and dig out the bottom of the river on 11,500 kilometres of rivers in Ireland, for no particular purpose, just that it's in the law, and if they didn't do it, they'd be open to being sued by landowners and so on. So that really has to change. We have to restore riparian woodlands like you see in the picture. And the photograph you're looking at, incidentally, is my local river. It's the River Talca in Dublin, and it is the most urbanized river, perhaps, in the country. This little patch that flows through some open space near my house, nevertheless, is rich in biodiversity. The water is foul. It's one of the most polluted rivers in Ireland. But because it has been completely ignored, because this is part of the floodplain of the River Talca, it has been allowed to rewild, and it has kingfishers and it has otters and it has amazing floodplain vegetation in the summertime, and in the winter this is what it looks like. A couple of weeks ago you can see that it's bursting its banks, and nobody's getting particularly excited about that or particularly stressed about it, because that's what the river does. And that water that you see on the field there is not in people's houses in Drumcondra further downstream. And yet that benefit from the floodplain is not particularly recognised. Now, I appreciate the local authority does recognise it, but this is not a protected area, or we're not trying to emulate this in other river systems. So rewilding of rivers definitely has to be an urban as well as a rural phenomenon. So finally, I leave you with this question. Amidst all the doom and gloom and the mass extinction and the climate breakdown, what if we get it right? What if we do the right things? What if we incentivize farmers for restoring riparian woodland? What if we allow rivers to flood? What if we take away some of the thousands of barriers that prevent the migration of salmon and lampreys and eels? What if we restore our uplands, woodlands and wetlands that allow nature to recover and allow water to percolate slowly down the hills? Now you'll see this beautiful drawing here from Jacek Maciak, who drew the illustration to one of my episodes in my podcast. And I think you get the idea that, you know, what happens in our rivers is a symptom of what happens throughout the entire landscape. So at the bottom of the river, just out of the view here, we have our freshwater pearl mussels. And as you go up in the image, everything that's happening in that image is driving the pearl mussels to extinction. But if we get it right, the opposite will happen. The freshwater pearl mussels will come back, and we can have a landscape that has high nature value farming, that has diverse commercial uses, that has amenity value, that is full of wildlife, that is storing carbon, that is cleaning our water, that we've learned to live with flooding, and we can do it to the benefits of people as well as nature. So I leave it there, hopefully on a hopeful note, on why we need to embrace rewilding and get it into our policy solutions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pádraig. That was a really great talk, a thought-provoking talk, and it has really helped set the scene for the rest of the conference. Can I remind the delegates that if they have any questions for Pádraig, we're going to take them in the Q&A session. So can I ask you to put your questions into the Q&A? Thank you again for getting us off to a great start and keeping us on time. So well done. We will now move on to our second talk for this first session. And I'm delighted to welcome William Cormacan and Sam Birch from the National Parks and Wildlife Service. William is the Western Regional Manager for the NPWS, encompassing Wild Nephin Ballycroy and Connemara National Park, while Sam is the District Conservation Officer for Mayo. They are going to speak to us today about riparian management in Wild Nephin Ballycroy and about some planned initiatives. And I believe, William, you're going to go first, and then Sam is going to take over halfway through. So thank you. You've turned your camera on and your microphone, and please get ready to share your screen when ready. So welcome, William.
Thank you, Catherine, and welcome everybody. As Catherine mentioned, I'm William Cormacan, and myself and my colleague Sam Birch are going to give you a bit of an overview of some of the riparian management ongoing and planned in the Wild Nephin Ballycroy National Park. Just a quick overview of the national park. It's 15,000 hectares, 10,000 hectares of which is peatland and upland, and 5,000 hectares is conifer plantation. As I said, the most significant part is on the west side of the national park is the Owenduff bog. It's the largest intact blanket bog in Western Europe. There's 4 major river catchments that drain the national park: the Owenduff to the west, the Owen Moor along the north, the Deal River, which is part of the Moy, is to the east, and then the Birch catchment is to the southeast. 3 of these rivers, they're SSEs. The Owenduff and the Birch are part of the Owenduff Nephin Complex SSE, and the Deal forms part of the River Moy SSE. These SSE rivers are designated for Atlantic salmon and otter, but there's other freshwater species in them, and in the Moy you get lamprey species and crayfish, and also there's a population of freshwater pearl mussel in the Deal. And I think this sort of leads on nicely from what Pádraig said. I said I better give just a quick overview of the Wild Nephin Wilderness Project. Now, this was originally a partnership between ourselves and Coillte. Coillte had the Nephin Forest, which now forms the eastern part of the national park. It was to be sort of managed, this project, as a wilderness area, roughly based on wilderness areas in North America, or the concept they have in North America. There was to be a 15-year conversion plan, and after that, we were supposed to withdraw from the area and let it go wild, in effect. Now, there has been a lot of delays in relation to the delivery of this project. There has been significant changes in circumstances. The Nephin Forest, which was managed by Coillte, and we were kind of equal partners in the project. Well, Coillte are leasing the Nephin Forest to us on a long-term basis, and it's been incorporated into the Wild Nephin Ballycroy National Park. So we will be the primary drivers now of this project. And again, there's the ethos and the objectives of this project has somewhat changed, and I'll deal with that in the next slide. But just to say that we have a consultant at the moment that is making amendments to the conversion plan, and we would hope to go to public consultation this year, have a publication of the draft conversion plan. And again, this is probably one of the big issues we have, wilderness or not, and I know that Pádraig talked about it, but the Nephin Forest is a highly modified landscape. Again, it would have been originally upland and peatland that would have been planted probably 50 to 60 years ago. There is, and there will always be, ongoing management issues with grazing and trespass, because it's surrounded by lands that are managed for grazing. And again, it will all require forest management. As if you see, that's a picture from the forest where you get conifer plantation that has never really been managed or thinned. The trees get over mature and fall over. So as I say, these areas will have to be managed into the future. There's issues in relation to fire. Again, rhododendron is a huge issue, and I think for For the foreseeable future, we'll be managing rhododendron on site. There's also issues of public access. The Bangor Trail goes up through the backbone of the national park, and also the Western Way goes through the Nephin Forest. So we will always have public access on that. And the area doesn't fit that well in with the definition of wilderness. Now, this is a definition from Wild Europe, but a wilderness is an area governed by natural processes. It is composed of native habitats and species, and large enough for effective ecological functioning of natural processes. It is unmodified or slightly modified, and without intrusive or extractive human activity, settlement, infrastructure, or visual disturbance. So the national park doesn't really suit that definition. And I think the conversion plan, when it comes out, will be focused on rewilding and managing the areas of wild areas as wild areas, but it won't be a wilderness. So I'm just going to talk about this project that we submitted an application to this year. It's called Naturaback. We say last year there was a European Green Deal call. It was Horizon 2020 funded. Again, there's 1 billion for research in innovative projects that respond to the climate crisis and help protect Europe's unique ecosystems and biodiversities. We are part of a consortium of 18 different partners from 12 different countries. The title of the project that we've submitted is Naturaback, and putting nature back as a keystone for climate resilience, economic growth, and human well-being in Europe. The objective of the project is to demonstrate and promote systemic and cost-effective solutions for upscaling on restoration efforts from throughout Europe. So we hope the work that we do can be scaled up and applied elsewhere in Ireland. And again, it's another objective of it in delivering restoration on an unprecedented scale in Europe. There's 9 sites in 8 countries working across and benefiting almost 600,000 hectares of key habitats and sequestering nearly 450,000 tons of CO2 equivalents by the end of the project, and they're looking at 1.5 million tons by 2041. So just how the project will apply to the Wild Nephin National Park. We will be a demonstration site. There's 3 work packages for restoration: woodland restoration, peatland ecosystem restoration, and restoration of river and wetland habitats, and we are undertaking all 3 of them. We hope, if the application is successful, we'll get 1.85 million of direct funding into this work inside the national park, and the application is presently being evaluated, and if approved, we would hope to start work in 2021. So the Peaklings ecosystem restoration, and that slide shows a view looking down the Peaklings River. It's a tributary of the Alpnabrochie, which is again part of the Owen Moor system. If you see the woodland there on the right hand side as you look down, that would have been planted in the mid-90s. It's failed woodland. I think the forestry term is in check. It will not grow any more than that. It's less than 5 meters high. There's open canopy. There's rhododendron is invasive there. It's not that bad in this part of the park, but the plan is, as part of this project, that we would fell the trees to waste, we would drain block, and we would remove the road, and we would monitor the success of it in the hope that we would be able to apply it elsewhere and upscale it. So, and you can see again some planting tubes down that's the either side of the river, and I know Sam is going to talk about some of that work that we're doing in the park later on. Again, the woodland habitat and the river and wetland habitat, their work packages 6 and 8. All that will be happening in the Shariva catchment. Now, this is a subcatchment of the Birch, which is managed by the Marine Institute, and it's a catchment that's dedicated to research. The Shariva is the most important spawning river within the catchment. Again, it's SSE designated for Atlantic salmon and otter. The entire subcatchment of the Shariva is less than 600 hectares, 90% of which is within the national park. There's 6 kilometres of main channel, and there's, as part of the project, we're looking at 4 kilometres of the main channel and 6 kilometres of the feeder streams and drains, and that includes all drains and streams that are outlined in the 1842 OS maps. And look, that's just a typical picture of the Shariva, where, as I said, planting that would have happened maybe 60 years ago didn't allow for proper buffers. There's planting right up to the edge of the river, and again, a lot of the woodland is poorly managed in that it would never have been properly thinned. again, the work that we're doing under the woodland habitat restoration, we're looking at managing 50 hectares. Herbivore management will be part of it. Deer have recently moved into the area, and we have issues with sheep coming into the national park from the neighbouring commonages. So we'll be looking about establishing 4 kilometres of deer fencing. We hope to restructure about 30 hectares of the, I suppose, commercial plantation, conifer plantation that's in there. Again, we will do an 80% thinning and remove the timber. And we would hope that we would get a kind of a poor man's Caledonian forest, where the ground vegetation would go back into peatland, and that it would be open, it would be an open canopy, and that the conifers wouldn't go over mature, that they would stay in check, and that's what we would get. Again, road was a huge issue in this part of the park, and you can see from that photograph, it's there and it's extremely invasive. So we'll be looking to take 100 hectares of road removal as part of the project. We would look to clear fend 10 hectares of reasonably good spruce pine plantation and replant with native broadleaves. And again, in fairness to Quilcha, before we took over the Neffin Forest, they had undertaken some native woodland planting within the catchment. Some of it didn't do that well and wasn't that successful. So we're looking at enhancing those areas and doing some supplementary planting. And because the catchment is so important and the Marine Institute has so much research done on it, part of the monitoring will be done in conjunction with the Marine Institute. Again, the wetlands and rivers habitat that we'll be working on, again, the riparian management will be looking to relocate the original physical structure. We'll be managing or removing all conifers from 25 metres either side of the river channel and stream channels. We'll be controlling invasives within it, and again doing monitoring with the Marine Institute. Now, I might hand over to my colleague Sam.
Sam, can I make sure you have your microphone on?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect. And you're on full screen. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
So just to continue on from where William stopped there, just to quickly go through some of the challenges that we have been presented to us managing those riparian areas. So we've kind of decided to focus initially on woodland establishment along the rivers in the national park. And this picture is a typical example of where we've kind of done quite open planting of locally sourced, in some cases, native woodland. This is the Altahoney River on the eastern side of the park. Now, since 2018, we have planted about 5,000 trees. This is separate to anything Quilcha are doing, which is on a larger scale, including just north of here, there's an area just been deer fenced, which is 18 hectares, and it's 100% broadleaf along this river further north. We tried planting without tree guards and fences initially, but all trees were destroyed within 2 weeks by sheep and in some cases deer. So now everything has to be protected. This is just an example. On the Holes River, which runs just behind the fence there, and you can see just outside the fence we have sheep, and inside we have red deer. We had just got the sheep out, repaired the fence, and then you can see the picture in the left-hand corner. The deer broke the fence there, and on the right-hand corner you can see a little holly there that has been browsed. So a lot of maintenance and monitoring. The tree shelters then are very handy for areas that are hard to fence in the riparian zones. And again, without the tree guards, the trees don't stand a chance. And even where there are no sheep, they get browsed above the tree guards in some cases by red deer. You can see the picture in the lower right-hand corner. That's a 1.8 meter tube, and the tree has been browsed above this. And the picture to the left of that is further north on the Holes River, where we have birch trees in tree guards there. And again, they require a lot of maintenance due to the weather. This is an interesting project further south on the Altahoney River, where we were looking at trying to convert areas of mature rhododendron into native woodland. Now you can't see the river there, but it runs alongside the fence posts in the background. The picture to the left is the dense mature rhodo as it was. The picture to the right is what it looked like when we cleared it. And then the main picture was just taken last week, and that's a Scots pine. And it's a very valuable Scots pine because these came from rock forest in the Burren and are likely the only native Scots pine in Ireland that persisted through the native Scots pine extinction. So we put 300 in that plot and 700 more in other areas around the park. So going over to the west side of the national park, this is over on the Ballycroy side, and this is the Owen Duff, which is a very famous salmon river, a fantastic river, very natural. Flows through intact blanket bog mainly, but also some grassland areas. We propose a 13-hectare site for the native woodland scheme, and due to ecological factors, the final application is actually less than 3 hectares. That sounds negative, but some of it's for good reason. The main thing was there was dense mature rhododendron there, which we didn't have a budget to treat at the time, but we have now treated. The aquatic setbacks of 10 meters for the main channel, 5 meters for streams and 2 meters for drains. There's unplantable habitats, and then there are rare plant records that we had to survey for. So just on the rhododendron, you can see very tall rhododendron standing there. That's now all been treated, so should be basically standing dead in the next few months, and we would hope to remove it all. And the picture to the top right is at the back of that stand, and you can see that's a tributary of the Owen Duff there. And we have cleared some of the rhododendron, but you can see further up along it that where we haven't cleared it, it's completely covered by rhodo with no light whatsoever getting in there. And in the picture to the bottom right, again, is where we have treated the rhodo and cleared it, and you can see the tributary there. This is an example of the wet heath along the Owen Duff, which is typical unplantable habitat, so we just leave that alone. And then this is we'd surveyed for marsh club moss and ivy-leaved bellflower, and ivy-leaved bellflower was actually much more abundant on site than we thought. So grassland areas that looked good for planting, we've had to leave some of those because of the occurrence of the species, and also we have to have a setback there because of the shading potential from trees. And just very quickly, we've also applied for the Wild Rivers label for the Owen Duff. This is not a designation, it's not regulatory, and the goals are shown here on the slide. It's to protect rivers that are very natural in their shape and to go above the Water Framework Directive. You can see here that all the rivers that have obtained the label so far are in France, but it's expanding, and you can see the Owen Duff out to the west there. And just the last slide is just a provisional scoring of the Owen Duff, and you can see it has scored very highly, 89 out of 100, and picked up some bonus points. So we'd be very confident that it will obtain the label. And that's it.